My name is Albert Kahn. I serve as the Executive Director for the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP, at the Urban Justice Center. And we have submitted written testimony that explains in detail why we support the KEYS Act and Intro 1170 as important first steps to address the threat that biometric surveillance poses to New Yorkers. But I'm going to address the majority of my oral testimony to the claims we heard this morning from the administration officials because, quite frankly, I feel like I have been hearing about a parallel universe, one which has privacy restrictions from the city that bear no resemblance to what we see in reality on the ground in New York City today. I heard the claim that we may become something that resembles 1984. Well, Council member, let me be clear. We are far beyond anything George Orwell would ever have imagined. Today, we know that biometric surveillance is already being used to arrest thousands of New Yorkers. Programs like the NYPD's facial recognition database, which uses untested and scientifically unfound methodologies to try to find so-called matches for existing photos. We heard about a privacy commitment from the city administration that has not manifested on the ground. We were, I believe it was Councilmember Lander who brought up the very important concerns for undocumented New Yorkers that come from this sort of data collection and sharing. Specifically, how it compromises our promise to be a sanctuary city. But we know that this administration has included loopholes in city privacy law, in intros 1557 and 1588 from 2017 to specifically exempt the NYPD from information sharing restrictions, to allow them to share information with the federal government. And with the technology that we're talking about here in the residential setting, with facial recognition in homes, in our very hallways, they kept telling us why we can't do it, why it's too hard, why it's too much of a challenge. Well, I put to you that if other cities around this country can ban facial recognition, if they can take a stance against the biometric dragnet, if they can have bills that go far further than what we are considering here today, then there is absolutely no reason why the city of New York cannot take these first steps and have these modest requirements simply to let New Yorkers know when they're subjected to biometric surveillance. I think perhaps most telling of all was the administration claim that there hasn't been a single complaint about the use of biometric surveillance in commercial settings. Well, I don't know who they've been talking to, but I get those complaints on a near daily basis, and I'm sure many of you do too. And if they have not been getting many complaints, I can tell you part of the reason why is because we don't have the requirement to post the very sort of notice we are demanding here today. Because many New Yorkers have no idea that simply commuting to the office, their face is constantly being recorded, fed into databases, analyzed, scrutinized, recorded indefinitely to be used by who knows whom for whatever purpose they want, and they have absolutely no right to stop it. We need to enact these reforms, but we also need to go further. And that's why I want to close by once again calling on the City Council to move forward with the only bill that would comprehensively reform our own city's data collection and use of facial recognition and other biometric surveillance, the POST Act. 28 council members have signed on already, and I urge the Public Safety Committee to give us a hearing, and I urge this council to vote and enact the POST Act into law. Thank you.
Committee on Housing and Buildings, Committee on Technology, Committee on Consumer Affairs and Business Licensing, and everyone in this room, good morning. Thank you. My name is Vanessa Bergonzoli. I am a member of the Tenants Association at 240 Broadway in Brooklyn, New York, the building I call home. I have volunteered to attend this meeting and offer testimony out of great concern for potential violations that the electronic key fob system poses to the right to privacy. The building where I have lived for almost a decade was sold earlier this year and a little over a month ago. My neighbors and I received a letter from Livingston Management, the management agent for the new owner and landlord of the building, indicating their plan to switch over from a traditional key to a fob system. I am providing a copy of their letter as part of my testimony. The owner, via management, asked for invasive information, including a photograph of myself, as well as the names, permanent addresses, and photographs of people in connection with my unit who would be receiving an additional fob to enter the building. I do not see why I should have to supply third-party private information to my landlord in order to gain access to the building for those who need to enter my home. That is a violation of their privacy, and in forcing me to provide it, I am made complicit in that violation by the owner and management. The letter from management stated that their reasons for the change from key to fob was an effort to improve, quote, an effort to improve security in the building and protect the building and its residents, end quote. Meanwhile, the owner is currently engaged in proceedings to evict many and eventually possibly all of the residents at 240 Broadway, making their claims about the improvements of security simply bogus. It's hard to believe they desire to make the building safe for the very residents they want to evict. A fob itself may seem harmless, but put the fob together with the surveillance cameras that have now been installed in the building, photographs of residents and their guests, and with the right technology, software, it can all turn into a facial recognition system used to track the details of tenants' private's life. Why should landlords have access to this level of data on tenants, especially under the guise of collecting such information to improve security, when in reality the same technology may also be used as a tool to monitor and potentially harass tenants? I was offered no choice. I was offered no information about the fob, nor about the tech companies that run the system with access to my private information, and whether they, in turn, will be providing that information to third, fourth, or fifth parties. In order to have a choice in this matter, and not without incurring significant costs, our building's TA sought legal representation to challenge the use of fob keys. The outcome is still uncertain. And in sharing my experience with you here today, my hope is that it be carefully considered by those who can help protect the right to privacy for all New Yorkers, whether they be renters or landlords. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Josh Steinbauer. I'm a New York City loft tenant. I just wanted to give a little bit of the actual experience of coming into a building with the fob system. From 2004 to 2014, I lived in a loft building in South Williamsburg. It's a community of creative folks and numerous units of live workspaces. In 2014, the building was served a vacate order from the DOB. All of us were locked out of our homes without access to our possessions, despite being protected tenants with provisional loft law coverage. Numerous legal actions were required, and the residents were sunk into over $100,000 in legal costs. When, after 4 years, we finally won and regained entry, the landlord had broken and propped open our windows, effectively turning our homes into a pigeon coop, which destroyed all of our possessions. We also found that we could not access the building with our old keys. Instead, the doors were changed to a fob system, and there were cameras set up in the hallways and in the common area on the rooftop. We were given only one fob key. The landlord refused to provide us with any fob keys for guests, even though that's legally required. There's no backup system, which is also a legal requirement, so if the computer crashes, we're essentially all locked out. At one point, when a fob key was lost, the landlords demanded that we come to their office and pay $35 for a replacement. What's more dreadful is the incessant tracking and surveillance that these fob keys offer. The residents know from previous and ongoing lawsuits that our landlord is hostile and litigious. Personally, I know through the course of the legal battle for our loft law protection that the landlord's lawyer tried to use my out-of-town work as a mean to exclude me from coverage. While my out-of-town work turned out to be completely legal, it did force me to dig up a seemingly endless paper trail of receipts and check stubs and bank statements in order to prove it. Unfortunately, the fob system just becomes simply a means for the landlord to eventually do this again, bring me to court, and not because it's any more true, but simply to bury me in legal fees. To me, it's an ongoing and daily harassment. There's something fundamentally unethical about residents being subjected to tracking and surveillance simply for exercising our tenants' rights. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, we've been joined by Councilmember Torres, Ulrich, and Kornicki. And do you want to wait and give your? Okay. Well, all right. Councilman Lander has some questions.
Thanks very much to all of you for being here, and especially to the tenants for sharing your stories. I think this is, clearly a much wider issue than any individual building knows or sees. It's been sort of fought between individual buildings, some large complexes, but landlords and their tenants. And because we don't have any way of knowing how widespread it is, I think it's really valuable to have your testimony. It just makes it even clearer why we've got to move forward. Both with the Keys Act, but then also with some broader prohibitions and guidelines on tracking technologies. So I guess that's the question I want to ask, Mr. Khan. You spoke to what other cities are doing, and I know that San Francisco and Oakland have banned facial recognition technology by law enforcement. Do you know, are there municipalities or states or even other countries that are restricting uses of these technologies by landlords and businesses?
So it's something that's emerging as a real point of contention around the world. I know off the top of my head that Oakland has a bill that's actively under consideration, Portland, that would ban private sector use of facial recognition. And so besides the Portland bill, I'm not immediately aware of other bans that would apply to private sector implications, but we can certainly send follow-up information about the municipalities that have done that. And I would also want to note that recently in London, the senior law enforcement officials have come out against their own use of facial recognition, highlighting the discriminatory impact on people of color, as well as the overall privacy cost. But we will certainly follow up with more examples.
And then I'd just love to hear, I guess, from the panel in general, a little more as we're thinking, downstream. Again, hopefully we'll get the Keys Act passed, which will at least mean everybody gets a key and isn't required to use any of these other systems. But as we're thinking a little further forward, do you have a gut on where we should just prohibit things, like we should not have facial recognition technology, where we should restrict the data and tracking? So, for example, it could be okay to have a swipe or a key card so long as that data was not being retained and made available. How do you think about what you would want to have as we develop a longer-term policy here? And anyone that's got a point of view on it, I'm interested to hear.
Well, it sounded to me like the city didn't want to be particularly responsible for the housing that it is responsible for. So to me, it seems like you get rid of all of the facial recognition technology or a landlord's ability to track and surveil their tenants, like across the board.
So STOP believes that facial recognition is not compatible with a free and democratic society, and that we need to ban the technology comprehensively. One of our big concerns with key fobs and other forms of entry passes is currently federal law allows ICE to come in and subpoena that information with very little protection. And no matter what moves the city council makes, federal law will preempt city law so long as that data exists. So the strongest path forward to protect privacy is to simply prevent that data from being collected in the first place through bills like the Keys Act, but also bills that would go further and talk about the use of smart thermostats and other appliance monitoring within apartments. If that data can be used by a landlord to monitor when someone's home or not. Similarly, we have to look at the data that the city is aggregating, which itself can be used by ICE, such as plans to expand tracking through congestion pricing, as well as the city's work with the MTA to promote the Omni Fare payment system, which again collects a lot of individualized data on New Yorkers as they travel around, creating a repository which can potentially be excluded, can potentially be used by ICE. And this is the reason a lot of immigration advocates came out in opposition to the administration's plan to add a payment chip to the ID NYC municipal ID, fearing that just this sort of data aggregation by the city can inadvertently make us ICE's best friend.
Just to make sure I understand this, so, let's say, for example, we wound up saying about a key fob or a cell phone type lock technology, which understandably some people find very convenient. You don't have to find your key, you just walk by the door and it opens for you. But even if we took the step to say, to have a subsequent law that says you may not retain or sell or transfer the data that would come. Obviously, there's a digital trace on all those things, and if ICE came and sought to subpoena that information from a landlord, they could be obligated under federal law to provide it, even if we had a local law in place that sought to prevent that.
Exactly. So federal laws that would be directly in conflict with the city laws would preempt any city law. So you could potentially say, you will not retain this data. And then when ICE comes in and subpoenas it, there will be less of that data available. But if ICE comes in with a warrant requiring real-time transfer, there would be nothing that city law could do to protect them. And so this is one of the reasons why minimizing data collection is one of the most important strategies we've seen, not just here in New York, but in cities all across the country.
I just want to mention, here in Knickerbocker, we don't know exactly what data is being collected.
Right.
They haven't told us anything, so it's worrisome. We just have no idea. And being a community of 70% Asians, and most of them are immigrants, it's worrisome if they collude with ICE.
Yeah. No, I mean, your testimony, and I think we're going to hear the same from the Atlantic Plaza Tower tenants as well, really drives the point home that you're getting all of the risks and harms, none of the information, and none even of the reported benefits, right? So it sounds like you may actually, just from a narrow, might there be an intruder in the building, you might be more likely to have one now than you were when you had a traditional key, given the mismatches, the breakdowns, all the things that you mentioned. So there's no benefit for the tenants in terms of safety. You're exposed to all of the surveillance, and you have no information on what is being done with that information. So no, I mean, we've got to do more here, and I feel like on the one hand, getting you a key that would let you in will help, but we clearly need to go further to make some changes in what's allowed in that kind of tracking technology. So thank you again for being here this morning.
Thank you, Councilman Lander. I want to just mention, just at Knickerbocker, you said that the facial recognition didn't work many times, or it's just once it didn't work, or have you also heard complaints from the other tenants about it not working, the facial recognition?
Both. It hasn't worked for me sometimes. Actually, it didn't work for me at, the entrance gate on Saturday, and the security guard just buzzed me in.
So what happens? How long are you delayed?
I mean, if it doesn't work, then it just doesn't work. You're just standing there, dancing in front of the cameras. You see many tenants, do the same thing, and, maybe, it works for someone, and then everyone goes in. So I don't know, under what circumstances it works, but, sometimes it lets you in like that. Other times, you're just stuck. You're locked out.
Is there a sign in the building that says they're using facial recognition technology?
No.
There's no sign?
No.
And so you didn't have to sign any document as a waiver?
I don't think we did that. We just got notification that management is installing this facial recognition system, and that we have to go down and get our photos taken.
So you had to like it or not? You had to...
Exactly.
Okay.
We had no choice.
Just a question on the fobs. Your building had you only get one fob? Did I hear that right? So what happens? Do you have to pay for another one, or?
Right, exactly. So if I have someone visiting, I have to be there, or we have to coordinate handing them how we're going to navigate somebody getting into my home.
But they don't give you an option to purchase additional.
No, they would not.
But you don't have a key.
I mean,
also.
legally they're
So
supposed to. But
there's no key entry at all. There's no backup at all.
No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, the keys that used to open the door no longer work.
Okay. Did anything with a power failure? Did you ever experience a problem yet?
I mean, we just got back in, so there
You
hasn't
just
been a
got-
power
okay.
failure yet. But
Okay. Councilmember Chin has a question.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask the panel that, do you consider, I think Knickerbocker Village is in my district, and I know that one of the reasons that, the landlord was talking about, because a lot of people, they feel that don't live in the building or not on record, but we have such a affordable housing crisis in the city. A lot of families are doubling up, tripling up. Do you consider what the landlord's doing, with his facial recognition or key fob as a form of tenant harassment?
I guess I do. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I mean, it just feels like they're like tracking our every movement. Like, like there were things discussed that I hadn't even considered. Like, are they tracking like, oh, Christina goes in and out like 5 times a day. Like how necessary is that information? Like it doesn't really provide security or safety.
At STOP, we're quite concerned about how biometric surveillance empowers landlords to harass tenants, not merely by tracking every single action they take near the building or in building hallways, but there's emerging forms of artificial intelligence software called gate detection and other products that try to predict what our mood is. What, they try to say, is someone happy? Are they sad? Are they depressed? And that's another level of intrusive surveillance that landlords will be able to deploy unless we stop it here and now. And you can easily imagine the situation in which landlords try to predict who's going to be a, quote, good tenant based off of these sorts of highly invasive forms of AI and trying to micromanage every part of our activity. And we've already heard horror stories of people receiving fines and warnings for their activities in their own buildings because of these systems.
As I mentioned in my testimony, my building was sold earlier this year, and the new landlord wants to potentially evict and kick everyone out. We are a building of mostly working artists, one of the last surviving ones in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and this fob technology has the potential for being used as a method of harassment in light of the current circumstances of the tenants in the building.
I would say absolutely. One of the ways that landlords harass tenants in a situation like this is to take them to court to challenge whether they have, in our case, we have loft law coverage. And one of the ways that they harass you is to say, like, well, this might not be your primary residence because I see that you were not there for 2 to 3 months because you were, in cases of work or in a lot of other instances. And it forces the tenants to just, you're sunk in legal debt. I mean, it costs so much, it was $100,000 just to get back in our building and find all of our possessions destroyed. So it's just one of the ways that the landlords harass you.
I think, that is really happening across the city for many, many years. And I think that even in the case of Knickerbocker Village, the landlords is looking for a big rent increase. And I think that, for government subsidized housing and rent regulation, that we have to do more oversight. The tenant, should organize and complain about it, but at the same time, I think as a city, as a state, we need to really provide more oversight. Now that we have stronger rent laws, we have to make sure that landlords are not using these kind of technology to harass tenants and force them, to leave their home. So that's something that we look forward to working with you on. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Torres, questions for this panel?
Thank you for your testimony. I should confess that, I'm in favor of reforming and regulating the use of facial recognition technology. I'm not quite sold on the need to ban it altogether, but I'm open to persuasion. You were sharing your experience of landlords using facial recognition technology as a means of locking out tenants. In some sense, is that, if I understood your testimony correctly, or?
Locking out tenants? To deny them the coverage, the law protection coverage in our case.
Okay, I must have misunderstood then. It sounds like you feel like we're heading in the wrong direction because most of our bills are aimed at setting standards of transparency and accountability, but it seems like you're in favor of banning it. I want to just build on some of the questions that Councilmember Lander asked earlier. Are you in favor of a categorical ban on facial recognition technology, both public sector and private sector use? Is that your position?
Yes. Yes, that is our position. The reason why is, according to MIT and Stanford researchers, when they looked at all the commercially available facial recognition products last year, they found that for someone like me, they're pretty accurate under the right circumstances. But for Black women, they were wrong 1 in 3 times. 1 in 3 times. And when you have that sort of performance gap, you are baking in the sort of bias and discrimination we've seen for so many decades in New York City with human decisions, and you're automating it and you're making it more obscure and harder for people to challenge. Because we'll see New Yorkers arrested, and it will be on the basis of this facial recognition database. And they won't even know that a lot of the times. Thousands of them. And so even if you think that facial recognition has a place in our society, I would put to you that it cannot be a part of it yet. Not when it continues to discriminate at this level, not when it continues to get it wrong time and time again for the same communities that have been over-policed for so many decades. And I think when we see it in the housing context, we have those exact same risks, and we are already seeing this dystopian nightmare where tenants are being tracked and harassed and potentially even evicted because of these technologies that are fundamentally reshaping the power balance between landlords and tenants.
So it sounds like your objection is not so much to the technology per se, it's the underlying algorithm.
I would say
discriminatory bias built into the algorithm, is that?
I would say if the algorithms worked as advertised, it would still be deeply, deeply problematic because...
And why is it problematic at that point?
So if I get good news walking down the street and I start doing a silly little dance, I don't want to think that there's some form of AI that's tracking my movement, that's saying, is that movement pattern indicative of someone who poses a threat? Is that threat something that needs to be logged? Does that need to be sent to the NYPD? That's not an exaggeration. That sort of technology already exists. And it undermines our ability to freely move about our society when we second guess how every action will be misunderstood and miscategorized by some form of artificial intelligence. It's deeply chilling.
So your concern is that the facial recognition technology has a chilling effect on the free movement, couldn't the same be said of cameras?
Yes, the thing is, the biggest shift we've seen isn't technological so much as economic. Facial recognition makes it incredibly cheap to track moment by moment the movement of millions of New Yorkers. It would have taken tens of thousands of dollars to track a single individual 30 years ago, simply using a bunch of officers, using multiple cars in multiple teams. The cheaper it becomes to surveil all of us, the more that technology is used for incredibly small infractions. It currently is used for things like graffiti offenses and used for someone who takes a beer from a CVS. And so the cheaper it is to use these Orwellian technologies, the more often we will. But the thing is that I don't think we even have to get to that philosophical question for another few years because the technology is so blatantly biased and broken today. And so even if you don't agree that it is deeply chilling, I would hope that you do agree that there's a profound risk that as these tools work now, they are going to perpetuate the same sort of biases we see with human decisions.
I felt like in your exchange with Councilmember Lander, you mentioned in passing your concern about, you said indoor appliances or
So we saw.
the sensors in apartments. Is that what you're?
So there are smart meters,
Yeah.
which are devices that will monitor our electricity usage throughout the day. There's a concern that even the data gathered by those could be of use to law enforcement or ICE. For example,
Would you be in favor of banning those?
I would need to look at what the proper regulatory environment would be for those. I'm not, that's not something where we can say definitively today they pose such an outsized privacy risk that we would need to ban them. And let me be clear, our organization does not go nearly as far as a number of reformers in advocating for comprehensive bans. We only do it with those technologies that pose such a potent privacy risk that we see no possible path for them to be used without an outsized discriminatory impact.
You brought up the risk of ICE obtaining the information, which is not a risk that anyone here takes lightly. Is there any example in the country of ICE obtaining via subpoena information collected by facial recognition technology? Or
Of ICE obtaining,
Yeah.
well, we know.
has that transpired before? Is that, or is that a theoretical fear? Or?
Well, let me take a step back and talk about sort of the information sharing environment more globally. So we know, for example, that ICE for years has used automated license plate readers. And then we found out in 2016 that they were using a vendor called Vigilant Solutions. It so happens that Vigilant Solutions contracts with police departments all across the country, one of which happens to be the NYPD. And then we found out that there were individuals who had been detained by ICE because of license plate data that was given, not in those specific cases by the NYPD, but by other law enforcement departments to Vigilant Solutions, which in turn, it was used by ICE. And with facial recognition itself, you have to understand this is such a new technology in its mass deployment that we aren't going to yet have the sort of data collection that we have with these other tools. What we do know is that they are trying through vendors like Palantir to aggregate this data at wherever possible, that they're using more data-driven detention practices to have these algorithmic systems direct them to immigrant communities. And we know that there's a huge danger there. And really, I think with ICE in particular, we can't wait until they've already abused this system to address the obvious threat.
But it sounds like the council's being too timid.
I would say the council, I would
That
always...
these bills are scratching the surface. It's not addressing the root causes.
I would say that these bills are important first steps,
Yeah.
but that more action is necessary.
Thank you for your testimony. So.
And thank you, panel, for your excellent testimony. We thank you very much for going through all the questions. And we're going to, before we call on the next panel, I want to recognize the chair of the Committee on Housing and Buildings, my co-chair for today, Councilmember Cornicky, for an opening statement.